If you want to join Thanksgiving, come wash the dishes, my daughter-in-law shouted over the phone. I replied, enjoy. When she saw the photos of my luxurious villa in Switzerland, my phone rang 71 times. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. The phone rang at exactly 2:17 p.m. on a Tuesday. I remember the time because I was watching my favorite cooking show, the one where they make those elaborate desserts I could never afford to attempt. The shrill sound cut through the peaceful afternoon like a knife through butter. Hello, Mabel. Marin's voice was cold, businesslike. No warmth, no pleasantries. Just my name spoken like it left a bad taste in her mouth. Oh, hello, dear, I said, muting the television and sitting up straighter in my worn armchair. How are you? How's David? She didn't answer my question. She never did. Instead, she launched straight into what I now realize was a carefully planned humiliation. I'm calling about Thanksgiving, she said, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. If you want to participate this year, you can come early to help with the dishes. The cooking and serving will be handled by people who actually know what they're doing. The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt my chest tighten, that familiar ache spreading through my ribs. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. People who actually know what they're doing. As if 37 years of cooking for my late husband and son meant nothing. As if the countless meals I'd prepared with love and care were just amateur attempts. I see, I managed to whisper, my voice barely audible. Good, come at noon sharp. We'll be eating at 4, so you'll have plenty to clean up afterward. There was a pause, and I could hear her satisfaction through the phone. Oh, and Mabel, don't bring any of your contributions. We have everything covered. The line went dead. She'd hung up without saying goodbye, leaving me sitting there with the phone pressed against my ear, listening to the dial tone like it might somehow take back the words I'd just heard. I set the phone down with trembling hands and stared at the blank television screen. My reflection looked back at me, a 64-year-old woman with graying hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, wearing a cardigan that had seen better days. When had I become so invisible, so disposable? The memories came flooding back, as they always did when Marin reminded me of my place in their perfect little world. It hadn't always been this way. When David was young, just the two of us after his father died, we'd been a team. He'd help me set the table while I cooked our simple meals, and we'd talk about his day at school, his dreams, his fears. But then came Marin. I remember the first time he brought her home. She was 25, 5 years younger than David, with perfectly styled blonde hair and clothes that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. She walked through my small apartment like she was inspecting a crime scene. Her nose slightly wrinkled as she took in my second-hand furniture and faded wallpaper. It's so quaint, she'd said, the word dripping with condescension. Very authentic vintage. David had laughed, thinking it was a compliment. I knew better. The changes started small. David began declining my dinner invitations because Marin preferred restaurants. He stopped calling as often because Marin thought he was too dependent on his mother. When they got engaged, I wasn't asked to help plan the wedding. Marin's mother handled everything, she explained, because it was less complicated that way. I should have spoken up then. I should have fought for my place in my son's life. But I didn't want to be the difficult mother-in-law, the one who caused problems in their marriage. So I stepped back, made myself smaller, hoped that my quiet compliance would earn me some affection, some respect. It never did. After they married, I became the obligation, the woman they had to invite to holidays out of duty, not desire. I'd arrive with homemade dishes that went largely untouched while everyone praised Marin's catered spreads. I'd offer to help, only to be told everything was under control. I'd try to connect with David, but Marin was always there, steering conversations away from our shared memories toward topics that excluded me. The worst part wasn't the exclusion itself. It was watching my son allow it to happen. David, the boy who used to curl up beside me when thunderstorms scared him, who'd insisted I read him one more story every night, had grown into a man who sat silently while his wife treated me like hired help. I walked to my small kitchen and put the kettle on for tea, a ritual that had comforted me through countless difficult moments over the years. As I waited for the water to boil, I caught sight of my reflection in the window above the sink. When had I started looking so defeated? When had my shoulders begun to curve inward, as if I were trying to make myself invisible? The apartment around me told the story of my diminished life. One bedroom, one bathroom, a living area that served as both dining room and entertainment center. The furniture was clean but worn, collected over decades from thrift stores and garage sales. The walls were bare except for a few photographs of David growing up, photos that Maren had never shown any interest in seeing. I'd been living here for 8 years, ever since I could no longer afford the small house where David grew up. The rent was manageable on my modest pension, and I'd convinced myself it was cozy, not cramped. But now, thinking about Maren's pristine house with its granite countertops and professional-grade appliances, I felt the weight of my reduced circumstances more heavily than ever. The kettle whistled, startling me from my thoughts. As I poured the hot water over my tea bag, store brand because the good stuff was too expensive, I made a decision that surprised even me. I picked up the phone and dialed David's number. "Mom?" He sounded surprised. I rarely called him directly, having learned that Maren preferred to control the flow of communication between us. "Hello, sweetheart," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I just wanted to let you know that I won't be coming to Thanksgiving this year." There was a long pause. "What? Why not?" "I think it would be better if you just had it with Maren's family. No need to complicate things." "Mom, don't be ridiculous. Of course you're coming. Maren just called you, didn't she?" The way he said it told me everything. He knew exactly what his wife had said to me. He'd probably been sitting right there when she made the call, listening to her reduce his mother to a dishwasher. "Yes, she did, and I've decided I have other plans." "What other plans?" His voice carried a note of irritation, as if my having a life outside of serving his family was somehow inconvenient. I looked around my empty apartment, at the silence that had become my constant companion, at the life I'd allowed to become so small that my absence wouldn't even leave a noticeable gap. "I'm going to do something just for me," I said quietly. "Enjoy your Thanksgiving, David." I hung up before he could respond, before I could lose my nerve and take it all back. For the first time in years, I'd said no to them. It felt terrifying and liberating all at once. As I sipped my tea in the gathering dusk, I had no idea that this moment of quiet rebellion would change everything. I had no idea that the phone call I'd receive tomorrow would offer me a way out of this prison I'd built around myself, brick by brick, compromise by compromise. But deep in my chest, beneath the hurt and humiliation, something small and fierce was beginning to stir. Something that had been sleeping for far too long was finally starting to wake up. The letter arrived the next morning, Wednesday, in an expensive cream envelope with my name written in elegant script. I almost threw it away, assuming it was another charity solicitation, but something about the weight of the paper made me pause. The return address read, Pemberton, Hayes & Associates, Attorneys at Law, from a firm in Hartford, Connecticut. My hands shook as I opened it. Nobody sends good news through lawyers, I thought, already imagining some final debt of my late husband's coming back to haunt me. "Dear Mrs. Eleanor Mabel Prescott," it began, using my full name in a way that made me sit up straighter. Nobody had called me Eleanor in decades. "We regret to inform you of the passing of Mrs. Cordelia Whitmore Ashford, who died peacefully at her estate on October 15th. As per her last will and testament, you have been named as a beneficiary. Please contact our office at your earliest convenience to arrange the transfer of assets." I read the letter 3 times before the words began to make sense. Cordelia Whitmore Ashford. The name transported me back 45 years, to a time when I was a different person entirely. Eleanor Cordelia Fairchild. That had been my name then, before I became Mabel Prescott, before I chose love over luxury and never looked back. I was 19, fresh out of finishing school, and heir to the Fairchild textile fortune. My family owned mills throughout New England, and our name opened doors that others could only dream of walking through. I'd been rebellious, even then. While my friends were making suitable matches with men from families like ours, I'd fallen head over heels for Tommy Prescott, a mechanic who worked at the garage where I'd taken my car for repairs. He was honest and kind, and made me laugh in ways that my proper suitors never had. He saw me as Eleanor, not as a Fairchild fortune with legs. When I told my parents I intended to marry him, they were horrified. My father threatened to disown me. My mother took to her bed with nervous exhaustion. The family lawyer explained, in terms I was too young and too in love to fully appreciate, exactly what I would be giving up. The Fairchild Trust was structured in a way that required family approval for inheritance. If I married outside our social circle, I would forfeit my claim to the family wealth, not just my inheritance, my entire connection to the family legacy. I was 19 and believed that love conquered all. I chose Tommy. The day after our small wedding ceremony, attended only by Tommy's family and a few friends, I received a formal letter from the same law firm that had just contacted me 45 years later. I was no longer a Fairchild. My trust fund was dissolved, my inheritance revoked. I was free to live my new life, but I would do it without the safety net I'd known since birth. I never regretted it. Tommy and I had 30 wonderful years together before the cancer took him. We struggled financially. His mechanic's salary and later his small pension weren't much, but we were happy. We raised David in a home filled with love, even if it lacked the material luxuries I'd grown up with. After Tommy died, I'd had to sell our little house and move to this apartment. David was already married to Maren by then, building his own life. I never told him about the family I'd left behind, about the wealth I'd walked away from. I thought it would only make him feel guilty about our modest circumstances, or worse, resentful that I'd chosen poverty over privilege. Now, sitting in my small kitchen with this letter in my trembling hands, I wondered if that had been a mistake. I called the law firm immediately. The receptionist transferred me to Mr. Pemberton himself, who spoke with the kind of refined accent I remembered from my childhood. "Mrs. Prescott," he said warmly. "Or should I say Miss Fairchild? Cordelia spoke of you often." "She did?" My voice came out as barely a whisper. "Oh yes, she followed your life with great interest. When she learned you'd married for love and left the family, she said you were the bravest woman she'd ever known. She never married herself, you know. Said she could never find a man worth giving up her independence for. Cordelia had been my closest friend during our finishing school years. We'd lost touch after my marriage, but apparently she'd never forgotten me." "The bequest is quite substantial," Mr. Pemberton continued. "A villa in Switzerland, along with the contents and a trust fund to maintain it. Cordelia felt that someone who'd once given up everything for love deserved to spend her later years in comfort." I couldn't speak. The room seemed to tilt around me. "Mrs. Prescott, are you there?" "I'm here," I managed. I can't believe this is real. It's very real." Cordelia was quite specific in her instructions. "The villa has been maintained in pristine condition, waiting for you. When would you like to arrange to see it?" When I hung up the phone 20 minutes later, I had detailed information about a property I owned in a country I'd never visited. The villa was located near Lake Geneva, with views of the Alps. It had been Cordelia's private retreat, furnished with antiques and art she'd collected over her lifetime. The trust fund would provide more income than I'd seen in decades. I sat in my kitchen, staring at the photographs Mr. Pemberton had emailed to me on my ancient laptop. The villa was breathtaking. Stone walls covered with ivy, tall windows that overlooked terraced gardens, rooms filled with elegant furniture that probably cost more than I'd spent on everything I owned. For the first time since Tommy died, I felt something other than resignation about my future. I felt possibility, but with possibility came fear. What did I know about living in Switzerland? About managing property and trusts? About being the kind of person who owned a villa instead of renting a one-bedroom apartment? My phone rang, interrupting my spiraling thoughts. David's name appeared on the screen. "Mom, what was that about yesterday? Maren's upset that you hung up on her." "I didn't hang up on anyone," I said calmly. "I simply told you I had other plans." "What plans? You never have plans." The words stung because they were true. When had I become someone who never had plans? When had I accepted that my life was so empty that my absence wouldn't matter? "Maybe it's time I started having plans," I said. "Mom, you're being dramatic. Just come to Thanksgiving." Maren didn't mean anything by what she said. I looked again at the photos on my computer screen, at the life Cordelia had left me, at the chance she'd given me to remember who I used to be before I made myself so small. Actually, David, I think I might be traveling for Thanksgiving. Traveling? Where? I could hear the disbelief in his voice. Poor old Mom, traveling, the woman who hadn't been anywhere farther than the grocery store in years. I'm thinking of going to Europe, I said, surprising myself with how good the words felt as I spoke them. Switzerland, specifically. There was a long silence. Mom, are you feeling okay? Did you hit your head or something? I laughed, and it felt like the first genuine laugh I'd had in months. No, sweetheart. I think I'm finally feeling like myself again. After I hung up, I called Mr. Pemberton back. I'd like to see the villa as soon as possible, I told him. Can you arrange for me to fly there next week? Of course, Cordelia would be delighted. As I began to plan my trip, the first real trip I'd taken since my honeymoon 45 years ago, I felt something I'd almost forgotten existed. I felt excited about my future. David and Marin had no idea that their humiliating phone call had been the catalyst I needed. They thought they were putting me in my place, reminding me that I was the poor relation who should be grateful for scraps of attention. Instead, they'd reminded me that I'd once been brave enough to choose my own path, even when it cost me everything I'd known. Maybe it was time to be that brave again. The plane touched down in Geneva on a crisp Monday morning, exactly 1 week after Marin's humiliating phone call. I pressed my face to the small window, watching the Swiss Alps emerge from the clouds like something from a fairy tale. My heart hammered against my ribs, not from fear of flying, which I'd managed better than expected, but from the enormity of what I was about to discover. Mr. Pemberton had arranged everything. A driver waited for me at the airport, holding a sign with my name, my real name, Eleanor Fairchild, written in careful script. He was a middle-aged Swiss man named Klaus, who spoke perfect English with a slight accent that made everything sound more elegant. "Welcome to Switzerland, Madam Fairchild," he said, taking my single worn suitcase. "Mrs. Ashford spoke of you many times. She was very eager for this day to come." As we drove through the countryside, Klaus told me about Cordelia's final years. She'd lived quietly at the villa, he said, tending her gardens and reading voraciously. She'd never married, never had children, but she'd maintained friendships with people all over the world through her extensive correspondence. "She received a letter from someone in your town," Klaus said, glancing at me in the rearview mirror, "about 2 months ago. After she read it, she called the lawyers immediately to make sure everything was in order for you." My stomach tightened. "A letter from my town?" "Yes, from a woman who knew your family. She had seen you at the local market and recognized you from photographs in old society papers. She wrote to Mrs. Ashford about how difficult your circumstances appeared to be." I closed my eyes, embarrassment washing over me. Someone had written to Cordelia about poor Mabel Prescott, the former heiress living in a tiny apartment, shopping with coupons, wearing clothes that had seen better decades. The thought of being pitied by my childhood friend made my cheeks burn. "Mrs. Ashford was not pitying you," Klaus said gently, as if reading my thoughts. "She was angry, very angry. She said it was wrong that someone who had sacrificed so much for love should spend her golden years struggling." We turned through a set of iron gates, and my breath caught in my throat. The villa rose before us like something from a dream. 3 stories of honey-colored stone, with ivy climbing the walls and tall windows that reflected the afternoon sun. Gardens stretched in every direction, filled with late-blooming roses and perfectly manicured hedges. Beyond the gardens, Lake Geneva sparkled like scattered diamonds. "My God," I whispered. "Beautiful, yes?" Klaus smiled. Mrs. Ashford always said it was waiting for the right person to truly appreciate it. He parked in front of the main entrance, where an older woman in a crisp gray dress waited on the steps. Klaus introduced her as Mrs. Hoffman, the housekeeper who had cared for the villa for the past 15 years. "Madam Fairchild," she said with a slight curtsy that made me feel simultaneously ridiculous and regal. "Welcome home." Home. The word echoed in my chest as she led me through the front door. The interior took my breath away. High ceilings with ornate molding, walls covered in silk wallpaper, antique furniture that belonged in museums. Every room we passed through was more beautiful than the last, a library with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a music room with a grand piano, a dining room that could seat 20 people in comfort. Mrs. Ashford left specific instructions that nothing was to be changed, Mrs. Hoffman said as we climbed the wide staircase to the second floor. She said you would know what to do with everything. She opened the door to what had clearly been the master suite. The bedroom was enormous, with French doors opening onto a balcony that overlooked the lake. The bed was a four-poster antique, made up with linens that probably cost more than my monthly rent, but it was the writing desk by the window that made me gasp. Sitting on the polished wood surface was a framed photograph I hadn't seen in 45 years. Cordelia and me at finishing school, our arms around each other's shoulders, laughing at something long forgotten. Beside it was a sealed envelope with my name on it. "She left this for you," Mrs. Hoffman said softly. "I will leave you to read it in private." After she'd gone, I sat at the desk with trembling hands and opened Cordelia's final letter to me. "My dearest Eleanor," it began in her familiar handwriting, though shakier now with age. "If you are reading this, then you have finally come home to yourself." I had to stop reading to wipe my eyes. I never forgot the girl who chose love over money, who walked away from everything she'd known because her heart told her to. You were the bravest of all of us, even if life hasn't always rewarded that bravery as it should have. I followed your story through the years. Yes, I had someone keeping track of you. Don't look so surprised. I knew about your happy marriage, your son, your husband's death. I knew when you had to sell your house, when you moved to that tiny apartment. I knew about your daughter-in-law's treatment of you, and it broke my heart. You gave up a fortune for love, and you raised a son who doesn't seem to understand the value of either, but that is his failing, not yours. This villa has been waiting for you, Eleanor. I've kept it perfect because I always hoped that someday you would need a place where you could remember who you really are. Not Mabel the obligation, not Mabel the disappointment, but Eleanor, the woman who was brave enough to choose her own path. The trust fund will provide you with an income of $15,000 per month for the rest of your life. Mrs. Hoffman knows all about managing the household and will teach you everything you need to know. Klaus will drive you wherever you need to go. All you have to do is live, truly live, for the first time in decades. You are 64 years old, my dear friend. You have at least 20 good years ahead of you. Don't waste them being small to make other people comfortable. Be magnificent instead. All my love, Cordelia. P.S. I've left you my camera collection. Remember how you loved photography at school? Perhaps it's time to take it up again. I sat at that beautiful desk as the sun set over Lake Geneva, crying harder than I had since Tommy died. But these weren't tears of grief or self-pity. They were tears of recognition, of coming home to myself after decades of being lost. Mrs. Hoffman knocked softly and entered with a tea service on a silver tray. "There is soup warming in the kitchen," she said, "and Klaus has brought your luggage up. Shall I unpack for you?" "Yes, please," I said, then laughed at how natural the words felt. When was the last time someone had offered to help me with anything? That first night, I lay in the enormous bed with its view of the lake, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a house that was truly quiet. No traffic, no neighbors arguing through thin walls, no sirens in the distance. Just peace. I thought about David and Marin, probably discussing my strange behavior, wondering what had gotten into sensible old Mom. They had no idea that their cruelty had been the key that unlocked a door I'd closed 45 years ago. For the first time since Tommy's death, I fell asleep excited about what tomorrow might bring. The next morning, Mrs. Hoffman showed me the rest of the house, the wine cellar, the conservatory filled with exotic plants, the artist's studio on the third floor with its north-facing windows. In the studio, I found Cordelia's camera collection, dozens of vintage and modern cameras arranged in glass cases like precious jewels. Mrs. Ashford said you were quite talented with photography as a girl, Mrs. Hoffman said. She hoped you might take it up again. I picked up a sleek digital camera, surprised by how familiar it felt in my hands despite the decades since I'd held one. Through the studio windows, the Alps stretched endlessly, begging to be captured. "Mrs. Hoffman," I said, "would Klaus be able to drive me into town today? I think I need to buy some appropriate clothes." She smiled. Of course, madame. Though perhaps first you should see the wardrobe Mrs. Ashford left for you. In the walk-in closet adjoining the master bedroom, I found an entire wardrobe in my size. Elegant dresses, tailored slacks, cashmere sweaters, even jewelry and scarves. Everything was classic, expensive, and timeless. How did she know my size? I asked, running my hand over a beautiful wool coat. She had your measurements from the woman who wrote to her, Mrs. Hoffman said matter-of-factly. She wanted you to have everything you needed to step into your new life immediately. As I changed from my discount store clothes into a perfectly fitted cashmere sweater and wool slacks, I caught sight of myself in the full-length mirror. The woman looking back at me was still recognizably me, but she stood straighter, her shoulders back, her chin up. She looked like someone who belonged in a place like this. For the first time in decades, I looked like Eleanor Fairchild again. That afternoon, Klaus drove me through the nearby village, where I opened a Swiss bank account and learned about my new financial reality. $15,000 a month was more money than I'd seen in years. The banker, a distinguished gentleman who had known Cordelia well, assured me that the trust was ironclad and would continue for the rest of my life. Mrs. Ashford was very specific, he said. You are to want for nothing, ever again. As we drove back to the villa, I asked Klaus to stop at a small cafe overlooking the lake. I ordered coffee and pastry, real pastry, not the store-bought cookies I'd been subsisting on, and pulled out one of Cordelia's cameras. The afternoon light was perfect, casting everything in a golden glow. I began taking pictures of the lake, the mountains, the medieval buildings, the swans gliding across the water. With each click of the shutter, I felt more like myself, more alive than I'd been in years. When I reviewed the photos later that evening, I was surprised by how good they were. My eye for composition hadn't been lost, just dormant. That night, I sat at the writing desk and composed my first social media post in years. I'd rarely used Facebook, but I still had an account that David had helped me set up years ago. I selected the most beautiful photo from the day, the lake at sunset, with the Alps reflected in the still water, and posted it with a simple caption, "New adventures begin with a single step." I didn't mention where I was or how I'd gotten there. I didn't explain anything. I simply shared a moment of beauty with the world. Within an hour, the post had received more likes and comments than anything I'd ever shared. Old friends from high school, distant relatives, even some of David's friends were commenting on the stunning photograph and asking where I'd taken it. I smiled and closed the laptop without responding to any of them. Let them wonder. For the first time in my life, I was under no obligation to explain myself to anyone. As I prepared for bed in my beautiful room, I caught sight of myself in the mirror again. The woman looking back at me was transformed, not just by the expensive clothes or the elegant surroundings, but by something deeper. She looked like someone who knew her own worth. Tomorrow, I would explore more of this new world Cordelia had given me. I would take more photographs, learn more about my new life, maybe even start planning some changes to make the villa truly mine. But tonight, I was simply grateful. Grateful for a friend who had never forgotten me, grateful for a second chance I'd never expected, and grateful for the courage to take it. 3 weeks had passed since I'd arrived at the villa, and I was becoming someone I hadn't been in 45 years. Each morning, I woke in the four-poster bed with Lake Geneva sparkling outside my windows, and for a few moments, I couldn't quite believe this was my life. Mrs. Hoffman had become more than a housekeeper. She was my guide into a world I'd almost forgotten existed. She taught me the routines of the villa, introduced me to the local merchants who had served Cordelia for years, and gently reminded me that I no longer needed to check price tags or count pennies. "Madame," she said one morning as I hesitated over an expensive bottle of wine at the village market, "you must remember, this is your life now. Mrs. Ashford wanted you to enjoy every day, not spend it worrying about money. It was harder to adjust than I'd expected. 45 years of careful budgeting, of choosing the generic brand, of making do with less, those habits didn't disappear overnight. But gradually, I began to understand what Cordelia had meant about living magnificently. I started with small things. Fresh flowers in every room, changed twice weekly. The expensive face cream I'd always admired but never bought. real silk scarves instead of polyester imitations. Each purchase felt like a small act of rebellion against the careful, constrained life I'd been living. The photography was coming back to me with surprising speed. Klaus had driven me to different locations each day: medieval villages nestled in mountain valleys, pristine lakes that reflected snow-capped peaks, vineyards that cascaded down hillsides in perfect rows. I was building a collection of images that captured not just the beauty of Switzerland, but the joy of rediscovering my own eye for beauty. One afternoon, as I reviewed the day's photos on my laptop, I selected the most striking one, a close-up of frost-covered grapevines with the Alps in the background, and posted it to Facebook. As had become my habit, I added no explanation, no location tag, just the image itself. Within minutes, the comments began flooding in. "Mabel, this is absolutely breathtaking. Where did you take this? Are you traveling? When did you become such an amazing photographer? This looks like Switzerland. How can you afford to travel there?" That last comment stung, even though I knew it came from curiosity rather than malice. How could poor Mabel Prescott afford Switzerland, the woman who shopped with coupons and wore the same coat for 5 winters? I closed the laptop without responding, but the comment lingered in my mind. It reminded me that back home, I was still seen as the struggling widow, the woman who lived in a tiny apartment and counted every penny. They had no idea that Eleanor Fairchild had awakened from her long sleep. That evening, Mrs. Hoffman knocked on my door as I was getting ready for bed. "Madame," she said, "Klaus mentioned that you seemed troubled today. Is everything all right?" I'd grown fond of Mrs. Hoffman over the past weeks. She was probably 10 years younger than me, but she had a maternal way about her that made me feel cared for in a way I hadn't experienced since Tommy died. "I was just thinking about home," I said, "about how people see me there." She nodded thoughtfully. Mrs. Ashford struggled with this too when she first inherited money from her family. She said it was difficult to step into a larger life when everyone around you expected you to stay small. What did she do? She decided that other people's expectations were not her responsibility. She said that trying to make yourself small to make others comfortable was a form of self-betrayal. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Cordelia's words, filtered through Mrs. Hoffman's gentle wisdom. Self-betrayal. Is that what I'd been doing for years? Making myself smaller and smaller to avoid making others uncomfortable? The next morning, I made a decision. I called the local photographer who had been recommended to me, a young woman named Amelie who specialized in portrait photography. "I'd like to have some professional photographs taken," I told her. "Not for any special occasion, just because." She arrived the following afternoon with her equipment and an infectious enthusiasm for her work. She was perhaps 35, with an artistic eye and a gentle way of putting her subjects at ease. "You have wonderful bone structure," she said as she arranged the lighting in the villa's library. "And your eyes, they tell such stories." We spent 2 hours taking photographs. Some were formal portraits in my new elegant clothes, others were more casual, me reading in the library, tending the garden, standing on the balcony with the lake behind me. With each shot, I felt more like myself, more like the woman I was meant to be. When Amelie showed me the results a few days later, I gasped. The woman in these photographs was radiant, confident, alive. Her silver hair was styled beautifully, her skin glowed with health and happiness, and her eyes sparkled with intelligence and humor. "Is this really me?" I asked, staring at a particularly striking portrait where I was laughing at something Amelie had said. "This is you as you truly are," she said simply. "Many people spend their whole lives hiding from the camera because they don't like what they see. But you came alive in front of the lens." That evening, I selected my favorite photograph, the one where I was laughing, wearing a beautiful cream-colored cashmere sweater that brought out the warmth in my eyes. I looked happy, sophisticated, and completely at ease in my surroundings. I posted it to Facebook with a simple caption, "Embracing this beautiful season of life." The response was immediate and overwhelming. "Mabel, you look absolutely stunning. I barely recognize you. You look 20 years younger. Where are you? You look like you're living in a palace. Is this really you? You look like a completely different person." For the first time since I'd arrived in Switzerland, I responded to some of the comments. Thank you for the kind words. I'm discovering that life can be beautiful at any age when you choose to embrace it fully. But it was the private messages that truly revealed how my transformation was being received. Several came from old friends expressing genuine happiness for me, but others carried an undertone of confusion, even resentment. Mabel, I'm so confused. Last month you were living in that tiny apartment and now you look like you're living like a millionaire. What's going on? It must be nice to suddenly have money to spend on yourself. Some of us are still struggling. I hope you haven't gotten involved with some online scam. These sudden lifestyle changes are usually too good to be true. I stared at these messages, feeling a familiar urge to explain, to apologize, to make myself smaller so others wouldn't feel uncomfortable with my good fortune. But then I remembered Mrs. Hoffman's words about self-betrayal. Instead of responding to the critical messages, I closed my laptop and walked out onto the balcony. The sun was setting over Lake Geneva, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that took my breath away. In the distance, church bells were ringing the evening hour, a sound that had become as comforting as a lullaby. This was my life now. Not because I'd won the lottery or married a rich man or done anything morally questionable. This was my life because a dear friend had remembered who I used to be and given me the chance to become her again. I owed no one an explanation. I owed no one an apology for my good fortune. And I certainly didn't owe anyone the right to make me feel guilty for finally living well. Over the following days, I began posting more frequently. Pictures of my morning coffee on the terrace, the fresh flowers Mrs. Hoffman arranged each day, the books I was reading in the library, the meals Klaus and I shared at charming local restaurants. I didn't caption them with explanations or justifications. I simply shared moments of beauty and joy. The comments continued to pour in, some genuinely happy for me, others increasingly bitter and suspicious. I began to see patterns in who responded with joy and who responded with resentment. The friends who were secure in their own lives celebrated my happiness. Those who were struggling or unhappy seemed to take my transformation as a personal affront. One evening, as I was reviewing the day's comments, my phone rang. David's name appeared on the screen, and my stomach tightened. I'd been dreading this call, knowing it would come eventually. "Mom," he said, his voice carrying that tone of forced patience I knew so well. "We need to talk." "Hello, David. How are you?" "I'm confused, Mom. Really confused. Marin's been showing me your Facebook posts, and we can't figure out what's going on." I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "What do you mean?" "I mean, where are you getting the money for all this? The clothes, the travel, the fancy restaurants? Last month you were living in that tiny apartment, shopping with coupons, and now you're posting pictures that look like you're living in some luxury resort." "I'm living comfortably," I said carefully. "Mom, comfortable doesn't cover it. You look like you've won the lottery. And that apartment, is that where you're staying? It looks like it costs more per night than most people make in a month." I could hear Marin's voice in the background, though I couldn't make out the words. Whatever she was saying, it was clearly agitating David further. "Mom, Marin thinks you might be getting scammed. You know those online romance things where older people get taken advantage of. Have you been talking to someone online? Someone who's convinced you to spend money you don't have?" The implication hit me like a slap. In their minds, the only way poor, naive Mabel could suddenly be living well was if she was being deceived by criminals. "David," I said, my voice colder than I'd ever heard it, "I am not being scammed. I am not delusional. And I am not your concern." "Of course you're my concern. You're my mother. We're worried about you." "You weren't worried about me when you let your wife tell me I could wash dishes at Thanksgiving. You weren't concerned when I was living alone in that apartment, struggling to make ends meet. Your concern seems to be very selective." There was a long silence. In the background, I could hear Marin saying something urgent, but David shushed her. "Mom, that's not fair. We've always cared about you." "Have you?" I asked quietly, because caring usually involves actually asking someone how they are, not just assuming they're being foolish when their circumstances improve. "So how are your circumstances improving? Can you at least tell me that?" I looked around my beautiful bedroom, at the life Cordelia had given me, at the photographs I'd taken that were scattered across the writing desk. I thought about the trust fund that would support me for the rest of my life, about the friends I was making in the village, about the woman I was rediscovering in the mirror each morning. "I can tell you that I'm happier than I've been in years," I said. "I can tell you that I'm finally living the life I was meant to live, and I can tell you that I'm not asking you for anything, not your approval, not your understanding, and certainly not your permission. Mom, you're scaring us. You're—" "Good," I said, surprising myself with how much I meant it. "Maybe it's time you were a little worried about losing me, instead of assuming I'll always be there to accept whatever scraps of attention you decide to throw my way." I hung up before he could respond, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. I'd just burned a bridge I'd spent decades trying to cross. But as I looked out at the lake glowing silver in the moonlight, I realized I didn't want to cross that bridge anymore. I wanted to build something new, something better. Something worthy of the woman I was becoming. The next morning, Mrs. Hoffman brought my coffee with a knowing smile. "You look lighter today, madame," she said, "like a weight has been lifted." "I think it has," I said, raising my cup in a small toast to the new day. "I think it finally has." The morning after my conversation with David, I woke to find 17 missed calls on my phone. 17. I stared at the screen in disbelief as I counted them. 12 from David, 3 from numbers I didn't recognize, and 2 from what appeared to be Marin's cell phone, though she'd never called me directly before. My voicemail was full. As I listened to the messages over my morning coffee served by Mrs. Hoffman on the finest china, I felt like I was watching a slow-motion car accident unfold. David's first message was apologetic. "Mom, I'm sorry about how that call ended. Please call me back. Marin and I are just worried about you." By the 5th message, his tone had shifted to frustration. "Mom, this silent treatment isn't helping anyone. We need to know what's going on. This isn't like you." The later messages grew increasingly desperate. "Mom, please. I've been calling all night. I'm starting to think something's really wrong. Just call me back so I know you're okay." But it was Marin's messages that truly revealed the depth of their panic. "Mabel?" Her voice was tight with barely controlled hysteria. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but it needs to stop. David hasn't slept all night. You can't just disappear and post these ridiculous pictures without explaining yourself." The second message from her was even more revealing. "Look, I know we haven't always seen eye to eye, but David loves you. He's talking about flying to Switzerland to find you. Do you have any idea how much that would cost? Just call us back and explain what's happening." I set the phone down and walked to the French doors that opened onto my balcony. The morning mist was lifting from Lake Geneva, revealing the Alps in all their snow-capped glory. Somewhere across the ocean, my son and his wife were losing sleep over my silence, but for the first time in years, I had slept peacefully through the night. Mrs. Hoffman appeared with fresh pastries from the village bakery. "Difficult news from home?" she asked gently, noticing my expression. "My son is concerned about my well-being," I said carefully. She nodded knowingly. Adult children often struggle when their parents begin to live independently. They prefer you to need them, even if they don't particularly want to help. Her words struck me like a physical blow because they were so accurate. David did prefer me to need him. It made him feel like a good son without requiring much actual effort on his part. My independence threatened the comfortable dynamic where he could feel virtuous with minimal investment. I decided not to return the calls immediately. Instead, I spent the morning in the village with Klaus, visiting the farmer's market and selecting fresh ingredients for a cooking lesson with the villa's part-time chef, Henri. I was learning to make proper French pastry, something I'd always wanted to try but never had the time or resources for. As Henri taught me to fold butter into dough for croissants, I felt a peace I hadn't experienced in decades. My hands worked the delicate pastry while my mind focused on the technique, the precision, the artistry of creating something beautiful from simple ingredients. "Magnifique!" Henri exclaimed as my croissants emerged from the oven, golden and perfectly flaky. "You have natural talent, madame." I photographed the croissants on the marble countertop, with the morning light streaming through the kitchen windows. The image was simple but elegant. The golden pastries, a cup of coffee in fine porcelain, and in the background, a glimpse of the lake through the window. I posted the photo with a caption, "Learning new skills at any age brings such joy." Today's accomplishment, homemade croissants. The response was immediate and intense. Within an hour, the post had dozens of comments, but these were different from the previous ones. There was an edge of desperation in many of them. "Mabel, your son has been posting everywhere looking for you. Please call him." "Are you okay? David says you're not answering your phone. This is getting ridiculous. Just tell people where you are and how you're affording this lifestyle." But it was the direct messages that truly revealed the storm I'd unleashed. From a neighbor, "Mabel, I ran into David at the grocery store and he's beside himself. He thinks you might be having some kind of breakdown. He showed me your pictures and honestly, I'm confused too. How did you go from struggling to pay rent to living like this? People are starting to talk." From an old coworker, "I don't mean to pry, but some of us are wondering if you might be in some kind of trouble. The sudden lifestyle change, the mysterious location, not answering your family's calls, it all seems very suspicious." From David's friend's wife, "I hope you know what you're doing. David is devastated. Marin says he's been awake for 2 days straight, trying to figure out where you are. Is this really worth destroying your relationship with your only child?" That last message made me set down my phone with shaking hands. Destroying my relationship with my only child. As if I was the one who had spent years allowing that relationship to deteriorate through neglect and disrespect. My phone rang again. This time it was a number I didn't recognize with a local area code from home. "Hello?" I answered cautiously. "Mrs. Prescott? This is Officer Martinez with the local police department. Your son filed a welfare check request. He's concerned that you might be missing or in danger." My heart stopped. "I'm not missing, officer. I'm traveling." "I understand that, ma'am, but your son says you're not responding to his calls and your recent social media activity suggests you might be in a vulnerable state. He's worried that someone might be taking advantage of you." The humiliation burned in my chest. My own son had called the police on me because I was living too well for his comfort. "Officer Martinez," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I am a 64-year-old woman of sound mind. I am traveling of my own free will. I am not in danger, and I am not being taken advantage of. My son's concerns, while perhaps well-intentioned, are unfounded. Ma'am, would you be willing to call him, just to put his mind at ease?" I looked around my beautiful kitchen, at the croissants I'd made with my own hands, at the life I'd built in just a few weeks. Then I thought about David, sitting in his perfect house with his perfect wife, so disturbed by my happiness that he'd called the police. "I'll consider it," I said. "Thank you for checking on me." After I hung up, I sat in silence for a long time. Mrs. Hoffman found me there an hour later, staring out at the lake. "Bad news?" she asked. "My son called the police because I haven't returned his calls." She raised an eyebrow. "Ah, the adult-child panic response. Mrs. Ashford experienced something similar when she first inherited her money. Her nephew tried to have her declared incompetent because she started traveling and buying art. What did she do? She invited him to visit, let him see for himself that she was quite capable of managing her own affairs. Sometimes the only way to stop the speculation is to show them the reality. That evening, I finally called David back. He answered on the first ring. "Mom, thank God. Where are you? Are you okay? We've been going crazy with worry." "I'm fine, David. I'm in Switzerland." "Switzerland? How did you get to Switzerland?" "Mom, the police called today. I had to file a welfare check because you weren't answering your phone." I closed my eyes, trying to find patience I wasn't sure I possessed. "You called the police on me because I didn't answer my phone for 1 day?" It wasn't just 1 day, and it's not just the phone calls. "Mom, your Facebook posts. You're posting pictures of places that cost thousands of dollars a night. Where are you getting this money?" I inherited it. The silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. "You inherited it," he finally said. "From who? You don't have any family left." "From an old friend. Someone I knew before I married your father." "What old friend? You never mentioned any rich friends." I could hear Marin in the background, her voice sharp and demanding, though I couldn't make out the words. "David, I don't owe you a detailed explanation of my finances. Mom, this is crazy. Last month you were worried about paying your electric bill, and now you're telling me you inherited enough money to live like a millionaire? Do you understand how that sounds? It sounds like my circumstances have improved. It sounds like you're being scammed. His voice rose, desperation creeping in. Mom, these online criminals are sophisticated. They can make fake websites, fake bank accounts, fake everything. They target lonely older women and convince them they've inherited money or won contests. Stop. My voice was ice cold. Just stop. Mom, I'm trying to help you. No, David. You're trying to convince me that I'm too stupid to manage my own life. You're so uncomfortable with the idea that I might be happy, that I might be living well, that you'd rather believe I'm being victimized by criminals. That's not... Mom, we just want to make sure you're safe. You want to make sure I'm still the same pitiful woman who accepts being treated like hired help at family gatherings? You want me to go back to my tiny apartment and my careful budgeting and my grateful acceptance of whatever scraps of attention you decide to throw my way? Mom, please. I'm going to send you the address of where I'm staying, I said. My decision made. You can verify that it's real, that I'm safe, that I'm exactly where I say I am. But David, if you ever call the police on me again, if you ever question my mental competence again, I will cut you out of my life completely. I hung up and immediately sent him the villa's address, along with Mrs. Hoffman's phone number as a contact person. Then I did something that felt both terrifying and liberating. I changed my Facebook privacy settings so that only confirmed friends could see my posts, and I blocked several of the people who had been leaving the most intrusive comments. My phone started ringing immediately, David calling back, probably in shock at my ultimatum. I turned it off. Mrs. Hoffman appeared with a glass of wine and a gentle smile. The first time you set boundaries, she said, it feels like you're being cruel. But boundaries aren't cruel, they're necessary. That night, I slept better than I had since arriving in Switzerland. For the first time in years, I'd stood up for myself completely, without apologizing or explaining or trying to make everyone else comfortable with my choices. The next morning brought a new flood of messages, but these felt different. David had clearly shared the villa's address with others, because several messages referenced looking it up online. Okay, I Googled the address and it's definitely real. It's some kind of historic estate. How did you end up there? I looked up the property records. That place is worth millions. I'm so confused about what's happening. But the most telling message came from Marin herself. I don't know what kind of con you're running, but David deserves better than a mother who disappears and then threatens to cut him off. You're being selfish and cruel. I stared at that message for a long time. Selfish and cruel. For living well. For being happy. For refusing to accept poor treatment. I screenshotted the message and saved it. Not because I intended to do anything with it, but because I wanted to remember this moment. The moment when my son's wife revealed exactly what she thought of me, and exactly how threatened she was by my transformation. As I sipped my morning coffee on the balcony, watching the swans glide across Lake Geneva, I realized something profound had shifted. I was no longer afraid of their disapproval. I was no longer desperate for their acceptance. For the first time in my adult life, I was free, but freedom, I was about to learn, came with a price. And David and Marin weren't finished trying to drag me back into the small, manageable life they preferred me to live. 2 months had passed since I'd last spoken to David, and the silence had become a gift I hadn't known I needed. Christmas was approaching, my first Christmas in Switzerland, my first Christmas in decades without the weight of obligation pressing down on my shoulders. Mrs. Hoffman had decorated the villa beautifully, with garlands of fresh evergreen and white lights that reflected off the lake like fallen stars. The grand fireplace in the main salon crackled with warmth, and the scent of cinnamon and cloves from her holiday baking filled the air. "Will you miss your traditional celebrations?" she asked one snowy evening as we sat by the fire, she with her knitting and me with a book of Swiss history. "I thought I would," I said honestly, "but I don't." For years, Christmas meant walking on eggshells, trying not to say the wrong thing, being grateful for the privilege of washing dishes after dinner. This feels like the first real Christmas I've had in decades. She smiled knowingly. Mrs. Ashford used to say that the holidays revealed the truth about relationships. The people who truly love you want you to be happy. The others want you to be useful. That wisdom proved prophetic when my phone rang on December 23rd. David's name appeared on the screen, and after a moment's hesitation, I answered. "Hello, David." "Mom." His voice was different. Smaller somehow, less certain. "How are you?" "I'm well." "How are you?" We're okay." "Listen, Mom, I wanted to call before Christmas. I've been thinking about everything that happened, and I want to apologize." I set down my book, surprised. "Apologize for what, specifically?" "For calling the police. For assuming you were being scammed. For not trusting you to know your own mind." He paused, and I could hear him struggling with the words. "Marin and I drove by your old apartment last week, and seeing it empty really hit me. You're really gone." "Yes, I am. I looked up that villa online. It's incredible, Mom. I had no idea you had connections to that kind of wealth. There's a lot you don't know about me, David. There's a lot I never told you." "Why didn't you? About your family? About your past?" I stood and walked to the window, watching the snow fall silently onto the manicured gardens. "How do you explain to your adult child that you'd hidden your past to protect them from feeling guilty about choices made before they were born? Because I wanted you to love me for who I was, not what I'd given up. And because I was afraid you'd think less of your father if you knew what I'd walked away from to marry him. I could never think less of Dad. I know that now. But I was very young when I made those decisions, and I thought I was protecting you both." There was a long silence. Finally, David spoke again, his voice thick with emotion. "Mom, I owe you more than an apology. I owe you. God, I don't even know where to start. The way we treated you, the way I let Marin talk to you, the way I just assumed you'd always be there no matter how little effort I put in. It was wrong. It was all wrong." Tears pricked my eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of relief, of vindication, of a burden finally being acknowledged. "What changed your mind?" I asked quietly. "Honestly, seeing how you've been living without us, the photos you post, the confidence in your voice, you're happier without us, aren't you?" I could have lied. I could have rushed to reassure him, to minimize my happiness so he wouldn't feel bad. But that would have been the old Mabel, the one who made herself small to comfort others. "Yes," I said simply, "I am happier." He let out a shaky breath. "That's what I was afraid of, and what I deserved to hear. David, I don't want you to feel guilty about my happiness, but I need you to understand that I'm not going back to the way things were. This isn't a phase or a rebellion. This is who I am now. I know, and I want to know this person, if you'll let me. The real you, not the version of you that we forced you to be." "What does Marin think about this conversation?" Another long pause. "Marin and I have been having some difficult discussions. She's not handling your transformation well. She liked having someone she could look down on, and now that's gone." I was surprised by his honesty. "And how do you feel about that?" "I feel like I'm seeing my wife clearly for the first time in our marriage, and I don't like everything I see. I'm sorry, David. That must be difficult." "Don't apologize. You didn't cause this. You just stopped enabling it. Marin's behavior toward you was always wrong. I just never wanted to see it because it was easier to let her be mean to you than to deal with the conflict of standing up to her." The admission hung between us, raw and honest. "Where do we go from here?" he asked. "That depends on what you want and what you're willing to change." "I want my mother back. The real one, not the diminished version we created, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to earn that." "Even if it means setting boundaries with your wife?" "Especially if it means that." That evening, I called Klaus into the salon. "Klaus, I'd like to extend an invitation to my son to visit in the new year. Just him. Can you arrange the guest room and help with travel logistics?" Klaus smiled. "Of course, madame. It will be good to have family here who appreciate what you've built." Over the following days, David and I spoke several more times. He was genuinely interested in my new life, asking about the villa, the village, my photography. For the first time in years, we had real conversations, not the stilted exchanges of obligation, but genuine communication between two adults who cared about each other. He told me about his work, his struggles with Marin's increasing demands for status and control, his regret over the years he'd wasted trying to please a wife who was never satisfied. I told him about Cordelia, about the choice I'd made at 19 to marry for love instead of money, about the friend who'd remembered me after all these years and given me a second chance at life. "I'm proud of you," he said during one of our calls. "I know that probably sounds weird coming from your son, but I'm proud of who you've become. And I'm ashamed it took losing you for me to see it." Christmas Day was peaceful and perfect. Mrs. Hoffman and Klaus joined me for dinner, and we exchanged small gifts and shared stories of Christmases past. I felt no sadness about missing the family gathering I'd been excluded from for so many years. Instead, I felt grateful for my new life, for the friends who'd become family, and for the son who was finally ready to know his mother as she truly was. David arrived in Switzerland on January 15th, looking nervous and uncertain as Klaus drove him up the winding road to the villa. I watched from the window as he stepped out of the car and stood for a moment, staring up at the ivy-covered stone walls and elegant windows. When Mrs. Hoffman led him into the salon where I was waiting, his eyes were wide with amazement. "Mom," he said, and his voice broke slightly. "This is incredible." I stood to embrace him, and for the first time in years, the hug felt genuine on both sides. "Welcome to my home," I said, and I meant it completely. Over the next week, I showed David everything: the village, the gardens, the views from every window. I introduced him to Henri, who taught him to make the same croissants he'd taught me. We took long walks by the lake, and I photographed him laughing as he tried to feed the swans. But more importantly, we talked, really talked, about his childhood, about the mistakes we'd both made, about the future we wanted to build together. "I've been thinking about separating from Maren," he told me one evening as we sat by the fire. "Not because of you, but because I finally see who she really is, and who I become when I'm with her. That's a decision only you can make," I said carefully. "But I can tell you that life is too short to spend it with people who make you smaller." "Is that what we did to you? Made you smaller?" "Yes, but I let you. I chose to shrink rather than fight for space. That was my mistake." And now, I looked around my beautiful home, at the life I'd built from the ashes of my old one, at the son who was finally ready to see me as I truly was. "Now I take up all the space I need," I said, "and I don't apologize for it." On his last night, David and I sat on the balcony wrapped in blankets, watching the lights from the village reflect on the dark water of the lake. "I know this might sound selfish," he said, "but I hope you'll come back to visit sometimes. Not to the old life, but just to visit. I want to show people who my mother really is." "I'll think about it," I said. "But David, you need to understand. This is my home now. This is where I belong." "I know, and I'm happy for you. Really happy." As Klaus drove him to the airport the next morning, I felt a peace I'd never experienced before. I'd reclaimed my relationship with my son, but on my own terms. I'd set boundaries and held them. I'd refused to shrink back into the shape they'd preferred me to hold. 3 months later, David called to tell me he and Maren were divorcing. She'd raged about my bad influence and demanded he choose between his mother and his wife. "I chose you," he said simply. "Actually, I chose myself, but choosing myself meant choosing you too." That afternoon, I posted a new photograph on Facebook, a sunset over Lake Geneva, with the Alps silhouetted against the golden sky. The caption read simply, "Every ending is a new beginning." The comments were warm and supportive now, mostly from people who'd come to understand that my transformation was real and permanent. The bitter voices had gradually fallen away, blocked or simply choosing to disengage when they realized I wasn't going back to being the person they could pity or control. But it was David's comment that made me smile the most. "So proud of my amazing mother. Can't wait to visit again soon." As I closed my laptop and prepared for another peaceful evening in my beautiful home, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. A cruel phone call from my daughter-in-law, meant to put me in my place, had instead awakened something in me that I'd thought was lost forever. I was Eleanor Fairchild again, not the frightened 19-year-old who'd given up everything for love, but the woman she'd grown into. Confident, independent, unashamed of taking up space in the world. Cordelia had been right. I'd had 20 good years ahead of me when she left me this gift, and I intended to live every single one of them magnificently. Outside my windows, Lake Geneva stretched endlessly toward the horizon, reflecting the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Somewhere across the ocean, there was a Thanksgiving table where my absence had once been mandated, where I'd been told I could wash the dishes if I wanted to participate. But here, in my beautiful home by the lake, surrounded by people who valued me for who I was rather than what I could provide, every day was a celebration. I was finally, completely free. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below, and meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.